I was 38 years old when a stranger in a gray blazer handed me an envelope with my name on it, and the first thing I felt wasn't grief, it was guilt, because for one terrible second before I even opened it, I thought, why would she leave anything to me? That's the kind of thing 20 years of being the invisible daughter does to you. It doesn't just wear you down, it rewires you. It teaches you to expect nothing and to feel undeserving when something finally comes your way. My name is Adele Marsh, and this is the story of how my grandmother's last letter didn't just change my life, it tore the roof off a family built on a lie so old everyone had stopped noticing it was a lie at all. If you've ever sat at a table where everyone's praise flowed to someone else while you quietly refilled the water glasses, you already know how this story starts. Stay with me. It gets worse before it gets better, but it does get better. Growing up invisible. I grew up in a narrow brick house on Larkspur Avenue in a town in Ohio small enough that everyone knew everyone's business and big enough that no one ever talked about the business that mattered. My father, Grant Marsh, ran a hardware and lumber supply business that his own father had started, Marsh and Sons, though by the time I was born, there was only one son left to inherit anything, my older brother, Preston. Preston was born 18 months before me, and from what I can piece together, that 18 months might as well have been 18 years, because by the time I arrived, my parents had already decided who this family's story was going to be about. Preston got the Little League trophies displayed on the mantle. Preston got his report cards taped to the refrigerator. Preston got driving lessons from our father on Sunday afternoons, the two of them laughing in the cab of the work truck while I sat on the porch steps with a library book, pretending I didn't notice. I want to be fair here because fairness is something I had to learn the hard way, and I'm not going to abandon it now just because I'm telling my own story. My parents weren't cruel to me. They never hit me. They never screamed at me. They simply forgot. Over and over, in 1,000 small ways, they forgot that I existed as someone who might also need to be looked at, asked about, celebrated. When I made valedictorian, my mother said, "That's nice, honey," while helping Preston pack for a business trip he was taking with our father, the first of many learning the ropes trips that were never once extended to me. When I got into a state university on a partial academic scholarship, my father asked, mostly out of politeness, whether I'd thought about just working at the store instead, since college was a lot of money for someone who wasn't going to run anything. Someone who wasn't going to run anything. I was 17 when he said that. I remember it precisely, because it was the first time I understood with total clarity that in my family my future had already been decided without me, and it had been decided that I didn't have one worth investing in. There was only one person who ever looked at me and seemed to actually see something. My grandmother, Ruth Calloway Marsh, my father's mother, lived 2 streets over in a small yellow house with a porch swing and a garden that produced more tomatoes than any 2 people could ever eat. Grandma Ruth built that garden, that house, and honestly the emotional backbone of our entire family with her own 2 hands after my grandfather died young, leaving her with a struggling hardware store and a son who was still in grade school. She never talked much about those years, but I remember once, when I was maybe 12, sitting on her porch shelling peas, she told me, "The people who make the most noise about how hard they're working, Adele, are usually not the ones doing the actual work. Remember that." I didn't understand it then. I understood it fully, painfully, 17 years later. Grandma Ruth was the one who showed up to my college graduation when my parents had a scheduling conflict, which turned out to be Preston's engagement party, an event they hadn't bothered to mention to me until after the fact. She was the one who sat with me the night I found out, quietly furious on my behalf, in that controlled, simmering way of hers, and said, "This isn't about you not mattering, sweetheart. This is about them not knowing how to see what's right in front of them. That's their limitation. Don't make it yours."
I built my whole adult life around not needing anyone's approval, because I'd learned young that approval in my family was a limited resource, and it had been all allocated to someone else before I was even born. I moved to Columbus. I built a career in structural engineering, quiet, technical work that nobody at family dinners ever asked me a single question about, but work that let me stand in front of a bridge or a building and know with total certainty, I made this exist. I made this safe. It was the only kind of proof I had ever needed, because it was proof that didn't require anyone's applause to be real. Meanwhile, back home, Preston took over Marsh & Sons in his late 20s, though took over is generous, since our father never actually stepped away, just slowly handed Preston the title while keeping every real decision in his own hands. Preston got a house down payment as a wedding gift. He got a truck. He got, eventually, my grandmother's original house on Larkspur, deeded over to keep it in the family line, a phrase that always somehow meant Preston's line, never mine. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need any of it, and for the most part, I believed my own story. Until the day the phone rang and my mother's voice on the other end said the 4 words that ended one chapter of my life and, though I didn't know it yet, began another. Grandma passed last night. If you enjoy stories where truth eventually finds its way, consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories. This one's only just getting started. Grandma Ruth was 84. She'd had a bad heart for years, but bad hearts in stubborn women like her have a way of holding on far longer than doctors expect. I drove the 2.5 hours home in a fog so thick I don't actually remember most of the drive, just the sensation of my hands on the wheel and the strange, hollow feeling that the one person who had ever fully seen me was gone. The funeral was small, quiet, exactly the way she would have wanted it. Preston gave the eulogy. Of course he did. He stood at the front of that little Methodist church and talked about Grandma's incredible legacy of family and business, about how she'd passed the torch to my father and through him to Preston, a version of history that conveniently erased the fact that Grandma Ruth had built that store back up from near bankruptcy herself, with her own labor, in the years after my grandfather died, long before my father was old enough to run anything. I sat in the second pew next to my mother and said nothing. That had always been my role. Sit, absorb, say nothing. Afterwards, at the house, surrounded by casserole dishes and sympathy cards, my father clapped Preston on the shoulder and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "She'd be proud of you, son, real proud." Nobody said anything to me at all. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. In that moment, I wasn't angry. I was just tired. The specific, bone-deep tired of someone who has spent her entire life waiting for a door that was never going to open, and who has finally, quietly, stopped waiting. I left for Columbus on a Tuesday morning, and I remember thinking with a strange sort of finality, that's it then. That's how it ends. I was wrong. It hadn't even started yet. The call came 11 days later on a Friday afternoon while I was standing in a construction site trailer reviewing load calculations. A woman introduced herself as Carol Whitfield, an estate agent in my hometown, and asked if I could come in the following week to discuss my grandmother's will. "I'm sorry," I said, genuinely confused. "I think there might be a mistake. My father and brother handle all of that." There was a small pause on the line. "No, Miss Marsh," she said carefully, "there's no mistake. Your grandmother specifically named you, and she left very particular instructions about how this meeting is to happen, including that your father and brother are not to be present." I stood in that trailer, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something shift under my feet that had nothing to do with the sight. What did an 84-year-old woman, gone now, have to say to me and only me that couldn't wait and couldn't be shared?
Carol Whitfield's office was small, tucked above a dry cleaner on Main Street, with the particular dust and paper smell of a practice that had been running for decades. I sat across from her in a stiff leather chair, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone pale. "Before we begin," she said, sliding a folder across the desk, "I want you to understand that your grandmother came to me 8 years ago to update her estate plan, and she came back 3 more times over the years to revise details. This was not a decision made in her final days. This was deliberate, and it was considered over a very long time. 8 years. I did the math without meaning to. 8 years ago, I was 30. 8 years ago, I had just finished my engineering certification, alone, with no one from my family in attendance, and Grandma Ruth had called me that night to say, 'I am so proud of you I could burst, and I don't care if nobody else says it. I'm saying it for all of them.'" Carol opened the folder. "Your grandmother's estate includes the house on Larkspur, the yellow one, her personal residence, not the one currently occupied by your brother, a modest investment portfolio, and notably a 30% ownership stake in Marsh & Sons Hardware and Lumber." I blinked. "I'm sorry, a stake in the business?" "Yes," Carol looked at me evenly. "Did you know your grandmother retained partial ownership after your grandfather's death?" I didn't. I don't think anyone in my generation knew. I'd always understood, the way you understand family facts you've simply absorbed without ever questioning, that the business belonged entirely to my father, and now to Preston. She kept 30% specifically because, and I'm going to read you her own words here since she was very precise about this being said exactly as written, she did not entirely trust that the business would be run, in her words, honestly, in the long run, by the people currently minding it. The room felt very quiet. She has left her entire 30% stake, along with the house on Larkspur, to you, Adele, in full, no conditions. I sat there, and for a moment, I genuinely could not make my mouth form words. Not because I was overjoyed, though somewhere underneath the shock there was a small, disbelieving warmth, but because my very first thought, the thought that came before anything else, was, Preston is going to lose his mind, and I'm going to be the reason. "There's something else," Carol said, and her tone shifted, became careful, deliberate, the tone of someone about to hand you something heavier than they'd let on. She handed me a sealed envelope, my name written across the front in my grandmother's looping, old-fashioned handwriting, the same handwriting from decades of birthday cards that always, without fail, arrived on time, when almost nothing else in my life reliably had. I asked Carol if I could step outside. I sat on a bench on Main Street in the cold, and I opened the letter. "My dearest Adele, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I imagine you're sitting somewhere feeling confused, maybe even guilty, wondering why on earth I've done this. So let me explain myself, because you deserve the truth plainly, the way I always tried to give it to you. I have watched this family for almost 40 years quietly decide that you mattered less than your brother. I want you to know that I saw it every single time. I saw it at your graduations, your accomplishments, the dinners where your news got a nod and his got a toast. I am sorry I did not fight harder, louder, sooner. I told myself I was choosing my battles. Looking back, I think I was simply afraid of the peace I'd lose by speaking up, and I let that fear cost you something I can never fully repay. But I want you to know this. I never stopped watching you, and what I saw was a young woman who built something real out of nothing, who never once asked anyone to hand her anything, who kept her integrity even when integrity clearly wasn't being rewarded in this family. That is not a small thing, Adele. That, in fact, is the rarest thing I have ever witnessed in a person. There's something else you need to know, and I need you to read the rest of this letter before you speak to your father or your brother. Several years ago, I discovered some things about how the business has been run, things that concern me greatly, things I could not fully prove, but could not ignore either. I have left you my share of the company not simply as an inheritance, Adele, but because I trust you, and only you, to look closely and to do whatever's right with what you find.
I have asked Carol to provide you access to the financial records tied to my ownership stake, records your father does not know exist in a form outside his control. I am not asking you for revenge. I never wanted that, and I don't want it now. I am asking you for the truth. You have always been someone who tells the truth, even when it costs you. I am trusting you with this because I believe, more than anyone else in this family, you will handle it with grace and with backbone in equal measure. Whatever you decide to do with what you find, know that you have already succeeded, simply by becoming who you are without anyone's help. That was never luck, Adele. That was you. I love you. I have always loved you. I am only sorry I didn't say it loudly enough, often enough for the people around us to hear. Your Grandma Ruth. I sat on that bench for a long time after I finished reading. The cold didn't seem to matter anymore. I want to pause here and just say something to you directly, because I think some of you have already guessed what's coming, and some of you haven't, and either way, I want you to sit with this feeling for a second the way I did. The strangest part of finally being seen after 20 years of being invisible isn't joy, it's disorientation. It's grief for all the years it didn't happen, wrapped around gratitude that it finally did. I folded the letter carefully, put it in my coat pocket, and walked back into Carol's office. I need those financial records, I said. All of them. Carol had prepared for this. She slid a thick folder across the desk. Years of quarterly statements, tax filings, vendor invoices, and something else. Correspondence between my father and a supplier named Delmore Industrial, going back nearly a decade. I am, by training, someone who reads numbers for a living. Load tolerances, structural margins. I know how to look at a column of figures and see instantly when something doesn't add up, when the weight being claimed doesn't match the weight the structure can actually bear. It took me 4 nights, working after my day job, spread across my kitchen table in Columbus, to see it clearly, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Marsh & Sons had for years been reporting revenue and inventory figures to Grandma Ruth, as a 30% shareholder legally entitled to financial disclosure, that didn't match the figures reported to the bank for loan purposes, which also didn't match the figures reported for tax purposes. 3 different sets of books, 3 different stories depending on who was asking and what my father needed them to believe. And running quietly underneath all 3 sets of books was a smaller, more specific thread. Regular payments disguised as consulting fees flowing out of the business to a shell entity that, after 2 nights of digging through public filings, I traced back to an address that made my stomach drop. The address was Preston's house, the one that used to be Grandma's. I called Carol the next morning. I think my brother has been quietly siphoning money out of the business for years, and I think my father either knows and is protecting him, or genuinely doesn't know, which honestly might be worse. Carol was quiet for a moment. Your grandmother suspected something like this, she said. She just didn't have the financial background to prove it herself. That's why she needed someone who could actually read the numbers. That's why she left it to me. Not out of guilt, not as an afterthought. She left it to me because out of everyone in our family, I was the only one equipped to see the truth clearly, and the only one she trusted to handle it honestly once I found it. For the first time in my life, being the overlooked one wasn't a wound, it was a qualification. If any of you have ever felt like your quiet, unnoticed skills didn't matter to the people around you, I want you to know they always mattered. Sometimes it just takes the right moment for them to matter out loud.
I didn't go into my parents' house guns blazing. That was never who I was, and Grandma Ruth's letter had asked for grace alongside backbone, and I intended to honor that. I called a family meeting, the first one I had ever called in my entire life, and asked my mother, father, and Preston to meet me at Grandma Ruth's house on Larkspur, the yellow one, on a Sunday afternoon. I chose that house deliberately. It felt right to have this conversation inside the walls she'd built. Preston arrived irritated, glancing at his watch before he'd even sat down. "I've got a delivery coming in at 4, he said. "What's this about, Adele?" "It's about Grandma's will," I said, "and it's about the business." My father's face did something complicated, a flicker of wariness under the usual mild impatience he reserved for conversations with me. "Your grandmother's estate is being handled through her attorney," he said. "I don't see why we need a meeting." "Because her attorney gave me 30% of the company," I said, "and access to the actual books, not the ones you show the bank, not the ones you show the IRS, the real ones." The room went very still. I laid it out plainly, the 3 sets of figures, the consulting payments, the shell entity, the address. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The numbers did the shouting for me. My father's face went pale, then red. "This is none of your business," he said. And there it was, the same sentence in different words that I'd been hearing my whole life. "You don't belong in this conversation. This isn't yours to have opinions about." "It is my business," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Grandma made it my business, legally, financially, and, I think, deliberately, because she knew exactly what she was doing when she chose me instead of either of you." Preston laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Are you serious right now? You show up with some folder and think you're going to lecture us about the business you've never once worked a single day in?" "I don't need to have worked there to read a bank statement, Preston," I said. "The consulting payments to Larkwood Logistics Solutions, that's your shell company, isn't it? Registered at this address, this house, the one Grandma left you. $140,000 over 4 years for consulting services that, as far as I can tell, never actually happened." Preston's face went through several colors in rapid succession, and in that silence, the silence of someone who has just been caught and hasn't yet figured out which lie to reach for, I saw for the first time in my life my father look at my brother with something other than pride. "Preston," my father said slowly, "what is she talking about?" It wasn't a question, it was a demand dressed as a question, and for once it wasn't aimed at me. Around the halfway point of a story like this, I always want to pause and ask you, has your family ever had a moment where one lie finally cracked open every other lie underneath it? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one, and I promise you're not alone in this. The confrontation in that living room was ugly, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much longer unraveling, one that took nearly 4 months to fully play out, mostly through Carol's office and eventually a forensic accountant she brought in as a neutral third party. Preston's defense, when he finally stopped denying and started explaining, was almost pitiable in its familiarity. He'd started small, years earlier, during a rough patch when his own personal finances had gotten tangled up after a bad investment. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he'd pay it back once things stabilized. Except things never fully stabilized, because once you start treating a family business like a personal safety net, the withdrawals never really stop. They just get better disguised. My father, to my genuine surprise, hadn't known the full extent of it. He'd known Preston was borrowing small amounts here and there, and had quietly looked the other way he'd quietly looked the other way at 100 smaller things over the years, because looking away from Preston's mistakes had always been easier than confronting the son he'd built his whole identity around. What neither of them knew, what nobody but Grandma Ruth knew, and only suspected, not proven, was the scale of it. Once the forensic accountant finished her review, the number that came back wasn't $140,000.
It was closer to $400,000, spread across 9 years, laundered through consulting fees, inflated equipment purchases, and a small side arrangement with a supplier who'd been quietly kicking back a percentage of inflated invoices in exchange for continued business. I sat in Carol's office when the final report came in, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not vindication, but a strange, heavy sadness. Because underneath everything, underneath the golden child treatment, the trophies, the unearned trust, Preston hadn't actually been thriving. He'd been drowning quietly for years, propping up an image of success with money that was never his, terrified of what would happen if anyone ever looked closely enough to see the difference between the son my parents had built their pride around and the man he actually was underneath it. I understood in that moment something Grandma Ruth probably understood a long time before I did. Being the golden child isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's just a heavier, more expensive kind of pressure, one that leaves no room to be anything less than perfect. And when a person is never allowed to be anything less than perfect, sometimes the only way to survive is to start lying about who they actually are. That understanding didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't make it okay, but it made it human. And somewhere in that, I found I could hold both truths at once. What Preston did was wrong, and what our parents did to both of us, in different ways, for different reasons, helped build the conditions that made it possible. The fallout, once it became official, moved fast. Marsh & Sons couldn't absorb a $400,000 hole without serious consequences. My father, facing the choice between criminal charges against his own son or a negotiated resolution, chose, after weeks of anguish I only partially witnessed, to have Preston removed entirely from the business, his ownership stake liquidated to help repay what he'd taken, with the rest structured as a personal debt Preston would spend years paying back. Preston lost the business. He lost the house on Larkspur, which had to be sold as part of the settlement, the house Grandma Ruth had built with her own hands, the one she deliberately kept out of his final inheritance, as if some part of her had known it, even then, that it needed protecting from him. He lost, too, something less tangible, but maybe more painful, the identity he'd spent his entire life being handed. For 38 years, Preston had been the one who was going to run everything. Overnight, he became a cautionary story whispered about at church and the grocery store, in a town where everyone knew everyone's business. I won't pretend I didn't feel something complicated watching that happen. There's a particular uncomfortable kind of grief in watching your golden child finally fall. Not joy, exactly, though I won't lie and say there wasn't some small, human satisfaction buried in there. Mostly what I felt was tired, the kind of tired that comes after carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down doesn't feel like relief right away. It just feels like your arms don't know what to do with the sudden space. My parents' marriage nearly didn't survive it. My mother, I think, had spent 30 years building her entire sense of self around the story of her successful son, and losing that story wasn't just painful, it was disorienting, like losing a language she'd spoken her whole life. But something else happened too, something I genuinely didn't expect. About 6 weeks after everything came apart, my mother called me, not Preston, me. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I've been going back through old photo albums," she said. "I found so many pictures of you I'd forgotten we even had. Adele, I think I need to ask you something, and I'm scared of the answer. Did we really not see you all those years?" I stood in my kitchen in Columbus, phone pressed to my ear, and I told her the truth, because Grandma Ruth's letter had asked me for honesty, and honesty, I was learning, was a kindness even when it was uncomfortable. "No," I said, "you didn't. Not really. Not the way you saw him." She cried on the phone for a long time. I didn't rush her off. I didn't rush to comfort her either, not right away. I just let her sit in it, the way I'd had to sit in it for 20 years, and when she finally spoke again, she said something I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix 20 years, Adele, but I want to try, if you'll let me."
I didn't answer her right away. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where I forgive instantly, tearfully, and everything wraps up neatly, and that version would be a lie. Real healing doesn't move that fast, and I wasn't willing to fake it just to give the story a tidier middle. I told her I needed time. I told her that being seen 20 years too late doesn't erase the 20 years, but it also doesn't have to erase what comes after, if we were both willing to actually do the work instead of just talking about wanting to. In the months that followed, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I didn't sell my 30% stake in Marsh & Sons, and I didn't walk away from it either. Instead, working with Carol and a small business consultant, I restructured my role, not as an active day-to-day operator, since my career and my life were built in Columbus, but as an owner with real oversight, real transparency requirements, and a board seat that meant, for the first time in the company's history, actual accountability. My father, chastened and genuinely humbled in a way I'd honestly never seen from him before, didn't fight me on it. If anything, I think some quiet part of him was relieved. Relieved not to be the only one carrying the weight of decisions he'd been making alone, badly, for years, out of a need to protect an image of family success that had never been as solid as he'd pretended. I used my engineering background, the same technical, careful eye that had let me see through 3 sets of falsified books, to help modernize the business's inventory and financial systems. I wasn't doing it out of some grand, generous impulse. I was doing it because it was frankly satisfying work, and because for the first time in my life, my competence was being used and acknowledged in the very place that had once told me I wasn't someone who was going to run anything. Preston and I have not fully reconciled. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories that pretend everything resolves into a bow are stories that lie to the people watching them. He's in a recovery program for gambling. It turns out that was the root of the original rough patch, a habit he'd hidden for years, the same way he'd hidden everything else. We talk sometimes, carefully. It's not warm yet, but it's honest, which is more than we had before. And honesty, I've learned, is usually where real repair has to start, even when it's slow. I used to think, in the angrier moments of that whole ordeal, that justice would feel like victory, like finally being handed the trophy that should have been mine all along. It didn't feel like that. It felt quieter than that, and stranger, and in some ways, harder. Justice, in the end, looked like sitting across from my father at Grandma Ruth's kitchen table. The yellow house is mine now, and I kept it exactly as she left it, tomato garden and all. And having him say, for the first time in my 38 years on this earth, "I got it wrong, Adele. I got you wrong. I'm sorry." It looked like my mother showing up, unannounced but always welcome now, on Sunday afternoons, learning slowly how to ask me real questions about my life and actually wait for the answers. It looked like standing in the renovated lobby of Marsh & Sons, a business that survived, chastened and smaller but honest now, and having the new operations manager, a woman I'd hired myself, refer to me simply as the owner, without a single flicker of surprise or qualification in her voice. And it looked most of all like finally understanding something Grandma Ruth had tried to tell me my whole life, in 100 small ways I hadn't fully absorbed until her letter forced me to. My worth had never actually been in question, only their attention had been missing. And attention, it turns out, however painfully late it arrives, was never the same thing as value. I had been valuable the entire time. I had simply been the only one who knew it. It's been almost 3 years since that day on the bench outside Carol's office, reading a letter that changed the entire shape of my life. I still work in structural engineering. I still love it, the quiet, unglamorous satisfaction of making things stand that need to stand. I go home more now, not out of obligation, but because there's finally something worth going home to. My mother and I are slowly, carefully, becoming something like close. My father calls sometimes just to ask about my work, actual questions, the kind he never used to think to ask. Preston is rebuilding something smaller and more honest for himself, one careful step at a time. And I find that I'm rooting for him, in the complicated way you root for someone who hurt you, and is also, underneath it, still your brother. And every summer, I sit on Grandma Ruth's porch swing, in the yellow house on Larkspur, surrounded by more tomatoes than any one person could possibly eat. And I think about the letter she left me, not the inheritance, not the vindication,
but the plain, quiet truth of what she wrote. That was never luck, Adele. That was you. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry away from my story, it's this. Being overlooked is not the same thing as being unworthy. Sometimes the people who see you last are simply the people who were never paying close enough attention. Your worth was never waiting on their approval to become real. If this story moved you even a little, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories. There are more stories like this one every week. Stories about the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who turned out in the end to have been right about their own worth all along. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.